The film's set was alive with movement. Technicians adjusting lights, assistants rushing to and fro with scripts and props, and actors rehearsing their lines under the harsh glow of overhead spotlights. The air buzzed with an electric energy, a mixture of excitement and exhaustion, as the final preparations for the day's shoot were underway. In the midst of all this, buried in the background like an unnoticed detail in a grand painting, was Clara. She was an elderly black woman, dressed in a faded gray uniform, pushing a cleaning cart that wobbled with every step. Her presence was a constant yet invisible one, necessary but never acknowledged. She had worked on film sets for years, yet no one seemed to know her name. To them, she was just the janitor. Clara moved through the chaos with quiet efficiency, picking up discarded coffee cups, sweeping away dirt trampled underfoot, wiping down surfaces smudged with fingerprints. She worked as she always had, without complaint, without expectation. She had learned long ago that gratitude was a luxury reserved for those who were deemed important. People walked past her as if she were part of the set itself, another prop, another backdrop to their world. Then it happened. Gerald Donovan, the film's director, was in one of his moods. He was a man who thrived on control, and when things did not go according to his vision, his fury became a spectacle of its own. A misplaced prop, a missed cue, a minor delay. Anything and everything could set him off. And today, his patience was thinner than ever. Clara. His voice was a whip crack, loud enough to freeze people mid-step. Clara, who had been sweeping near the edge of the set, lifted her head. She knew better than to respond immediately. She had learned that men like Gerald wanted obedience, not words. How long does it take to clean a goddamn floor? He stormed toward her, his towering frame casting a long shadow. Are you planning to finish today, or should we schedule extra days just for you? A few chuckles rippled through the crew, nervous, reluctant, but present. No one wanted to be on the receiving end of Gerald's wrath. No one wanted to draw his attention. Clara swallowed and nodded, quickening her movements. She didn't meet his gaze. She never did. Gerald sneered. Maybe if you worked half as hard as you eavesdrop, we'd actually get something done around here. The words stung, but Clara had endured worse. She simply kept working, sweeping up invisible dust as though she could sweep away the shame crawling under her skin. And yet, unbeknownst to Gerald, someone was watching. Leonardo DiCaprio sat in a chair not far from the set, quietly observing the scene that had just unfolded. He had been flipping through his script, preparing for the next take, but his focus had been broken by Gerald's voice cutting through the air. His eyes, sharp and calculating, had taken in every detail. The dismissive tone, the laughter, the way Clara's shoulders hunched ever so slightly. He saw everything, and he was not someone who turned a blind eye. The set returned to its routine after Gerald's outburst, but the tension remained, a heavy presence that refused to dissipate. Clara continued her work, her movements mechanical, as if she could will herself into invisibility. It wasn't the first time she had been humiliated, and it wouldn't be the last. She had learned that survival meant swallowing pride, enduring cruelty in silence, and pretending words didn't count. It was the price of keeping her job, the price of making it through another day without being noticed. Gerald, satisfied with his display of authority, moved on, barking orders at the crew, pointing fingers, criticizing every minor imperfection. His voice carried through the set, a constant reminder of his control. The crew obeyed without question, avoiding his gaze, pretending his temper was just part of the job. No one wanted to risk confrontation. No one wanted to be the next target. No one wanted to stand in the way of a man who held the power to ruin careers with a single decision. Leonardo DiCaprio had seen enough. He remained seated, his expression unreadable, his fingers resting lightly on the pages of his script, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent years in the industry, had witnessed the hierarchy that determined who mattered and who didn't, who was respected and who was disposable. He had seen actors and directors treated like royalty, while the people who made their work possible, the crew, the assistants, the janitors, were reduced to shadows, expected to endure mistreatment without complaint. He had always hated that unspoken rule, the way power was used to belittle instead of uplift. And now, watching Clara, watching the way she shrank under Gerald's cruelty, he knew he wouldn't let it continue. His opportunity came sooner than expected. The crew was preparing for the next scene, adjusting lights, setting up cameras, finalizing details, when Gerald noticed a smudge on the floor near one of the main set pieces. His irritation flared instantly. Without hesitation, without even looking, he shouted Clara's name again, his voice sharp, demanding. Clara, who had just finished cleaning the opposite side of the set, turned, gripping the handle of her cart. She hesitated, not because she planned to disobey, but because exhaustion was settling deep in her bones, because she knew that no matter how quickly she moved, no matter how hard she worked, it would never be enough. She approached without a word, keeping her eyes lowered, her steps careful, her presence small. You missed a spot, Gerald snapped, gesturing toward the floor with a dismissive wave of his hand. I swear, I don't know why we bother paying people who can't do the simplest damn task. Clara nodded, bending down to clean the smudge, her fingers gripping the rag tighter than necessary. The set had gone quiet again. People watched, but said nothing. Some turned away, pretending they were busy. Some exchanged uneasy glances, discomfort clear in their eyes. No one laughed this time, but no one spoke up either. Then, Leonardo's voice broke the silence. That's enough. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The way he said it, calm yet absolute, left no room for dismissal. The entire set froze, every pair of eyes snapping toward him. Gerald turned, disbelief flashing across his face before irritation took over. He narrowed his eyes, straightening his posture, as if challenging Leonardo's audacity. Excuse me. Leonardo didn't move from his seat. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He met Gerald's gaze without hesitation, his expression unshaken. I said that's enough, he repeated. You've made your point, and I think we all got it. A charged silence stretched between them. Gerald's jaw tensed. No one ever challenged him, certainly not an actor. Directors held authority on set, their word final, their control absolute. For someone to question that, especially in front of the crew, was an act of defiance he wasn't willing to tolerate. You don't run this set, DiCaprio, Gerald said, his voice sharp, controlled, laced with warning. I do. And part of running it is knowing the difference between leadership and abuse, Leonardo replied. His tone didn't change, still steady, still composed, but there was something in his eyes, something unwavering. You don't need to humiliate people to get your job done. You don't need to treat people like they're beneath you to prove a point. Gerald scoffed, shaking his head, disbelief shifting into irritation. Oh, I see what this is, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You're going to give me some self-righteous speech about dignity and respect, about how we should all hold hands and sing songs about kindness, right? Spare me. Leonardo still didn't look away. No speech. Just facts, he said. You're wasting time yelling at a woman who's just trying to do her job, while everyone else is too afraid to tell you that you're making an ass of yourself. The crew held their breath. No one moved. No one spoke. They were waiting for Gerald's reaction, waiting for him to explode, to retaliate, to reassert his power. His expression darkened, his mouth opening, a retort forming, but before he could speak, Leonardo stood. He didn't rush. He didn't make a show of it. He simply rose, setting his script aside, his movements deliberate, controlled. I don't care if you like me, Leonardo continued, his voice even, unshaken. I don't care if you think this is your kingdom and we're all supposed to bow to you. What I care about is the fact that you think you can talk to people like they're nothing and expect the rest of us to stay silent. He gestured toward Clara, who was still kneeling, rag in hand, eyes locked on the floor. She's been working here longer than you have. She's been cleaning up after you, after me, after all of us, and the least you could do is treat her like she exists. Gerald let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head again. You're really doing this, he muttered. You're actually standing here, in front of my crew, telling me how to run my damn set. Leonardo nodded. Yeah, I am. For the first time, there was no immediate response. Gerald's face twisted in frustration, but there was something else there too, uncertainty. He glanced around, realizing that the crew was watching, that they weren't laughing, that they weren't siding with him. Some were nodding. Some were staring at the floor, ashamed. But no one was defending him. And that was worse than any argument. Clara finally moved. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself to her feet, gripping her rag in one hand, her cart handle in the other. She didn't say anything, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was different. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Leonardo glanced at her, then back at Gerald. "We done here?" Gerald's fingers twitched at his sides. His jaw clenched. His shoulders rose and fell with slow, controlled breaths. Then, without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed off, disappearing behind the set. No one followed. And for the first time, the set finally felt quiet. The silence lingered, thick and unmoving, long after Gerald disappeared. No one dared speak, as if breaking the moment would somehow erase what had just happened. The weight of Leonardo's words still hung in the air, pressing against everyone in a way they couldn't ignore. Some looked at Clara, but she didn't look at anyone. She adjusted her cleaning cart, her hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions raging inside her, and without a word, she turned toward the hallway leading to the back of the set. She didn't need to stay in the middle of it any longer. She had done what she had always done, kept her head down, done her work, endured. But something about today felt different, and she wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. Leonardo exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. He had no intention of turning this into a grand speech or a heroic moment. He hadn't done it for applause, and he sure as hell hadn't done it for attention. He had spoken up because it was the right thing to do, and yet, standing there, watching Clara leave without acknowledging what had just happened, made him feel like maybe it wasn't enough. He could call out the abuse, he could challenge Gerald, but what would change if the person most affected by it walked away like nothing had happened? He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. One of the assistant directors cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly as if trying to gauge the right thing to say. "All right, let's reset for the next scene," he said, his voice tight, uncertain. "Back to work." The crew hesitated for a moment longer, but then, almost as if afraid of being caught standing around, they obeyed. Lights were adjusted, cables were moved, cameras were repositioned, and the energy on set resumed, though it wasn't quite the same. There was something unspoken now, something that had shifted, but no one was ready to address it. Leonardo didn't move. He watched as everyone scattered, each person pretending as if nothing had happened, but their faces told a different story. Some looked guilty, some looked relieved, and some looked like they were waiting for someone else to speak first. He wasn't surprised. He had been in this industry long enough to know how people functioned under authority. Most weren't bad people. They just valued their jobs more than their morals. He had never been like that, and he never would be. He turned away from the set, stepping toward the hallway where Clara had disappeared. He wasn't sure what he would say, or if she even wanted to hear anything at all, but he wasn't going to let her walk away like nothing had happened. He found her near a storage closet, her back turned as she sorted through cleaning supplies. She wasn't rushing, but she wasn't still either. There was a kind of precision in her movements that told him she was trying not to think about what had just happened. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her for a moment before he finally spoke. "You don't have to act like that didn't just happen." Clara's hands froze for half a second before she continued stacking the cleaning rags. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. DiCaprio." Her voice was calm, but it wasn't natural. It was the kind of calm that had been practiced over years of necessity. Leonardo shook his head. "You do." Clara finished what she was doing, closed the cabinet, and turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, taking in everything about him. "You spoke up," she said after a long moment. "That's not something people do." Leonardo held her gaze. "That's the problem." Clara exhaled slowly, her fingers resting against the cleaning cart. "And what do you think happens now?" Her voice wasn't unkind, but there was something in it that told him she had seen this before. She had seen men come in with good intentions, with righteous anger, with the belief that they could make a difference. And she had seen them leave just as quickly, their words fading into nothing, their actions changing nothing at all. Leonardo wasn't like them. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that if someone doesn't start doing something about this, then nothing changes." Clara nodded slightly, but it wasn't agreement, it was understanding. "And what happens to you? You think a director like him is just going to let this go? You think standing up for me isn't going to come back and bite you?" Leonardo let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I don't care." Clara studied him for a long time, her face unreadable. Then, finally, she sighed and turned back to her cart. "I appreciate what you did," she said, her voice quieter now. "But I've been working on sets like this for a long time. I've learned that people like Gerald don't just disappear. And I've learned that when people stand up for folks like me, they end up getting burned." Leonardo didn't look away. "Then maybe it's time that changed." Clara didn't respond right away. She finished adjusting her cart, straightened up, and met his gaze once more. There was something different in her expression now, not gratitude, not relief, but something closer to curiosity. She didn't trust easily, that much was clear. But for the first time in a long time, she looked like she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Leonardo stepped back, giving her space. "You don't have to believe me," he said. "But watch what happens next." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara standing in the dimly lit hallway, her fingers gripping the handle of her cart just a little tighter than before. The set was waiting for him, but Leonardo wasn't thinking about the next scene or his next line. He was thinking about Gerald, about the way the crew had reacted, about the way silence had become the accepted response to men like him. He was thinking about what came next, about what needed to be done, about what he was willing to risk. And he already knew his answer. Leonardo stepped back onto the set, his mind already working through the next step. The crew had resumed their work, but the tension hadn't faded. People were careful, quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact, as if unsure where to stand in the aftermath of what had happened. Some whispered among themselves, throwing glances in his direction, but no one spoke up. Gerald was nowhere to be seen, but everyone knew he wouldn't stay gone for long. A director like him wouldn't let something like this go unanswered. Leonardo had just done something most actors wouldn't dare. He had openly challenged the man in charge, in front of the entire crew, and that wasn't something that could be ignored. One of the assistant directors approached him cautiously, holding a clipboard, his voice measured, careful. "We're setting up for your next scene," he said, as if nothing had happened. As if they could all just move on. "It should be ready in 10. Leonardo nodded, but his eyes swept the set, scanning faces, looking for something, anything, that told him he hadn't just spoken into nothing. Some crew members deliberately avoided his gaze, choosing to stay focused on their tasks, but a few, just a few, gave him the slightest nod, the smallest acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was something. It meant people were paying attention. It meant that maybe, just maybe, the silence had been cracked, if only a little. A movement near the side of the set caught his attention. Gerald had returned. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in his jaw and the way he walked with precise, controlled steps told Leonardo everything he needed to know. He was furious, and he wasn't going to let this go. He approached Leonardo without hesitation, his hands clenched at his sides, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the noise of the set. "You think that little stunt you pulled was impressive?" Gerald's tone was measured, controlled, but the anger was there, just beneath the surface. "You think you can walk onto my set and challenge me in front of my crew like that?" Leonardo didn't react. He didn't need to. He met Gerald's gaze, calm, unwavering, waiting for him to get to the point. He wasn't afraid of whatever threat was coming next. Gerald leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, making sure no one else could hear. "I don't care who you are, DiCaprio," he said, each word laced with warning. "I don't care how many awards you've won, how many people think you're some golden boy. You don't run this set. I do. And if you ever undermine me like that again, I will make damn sure you never work on one of my projects again." Leonardo let the words settle between them for a moment before he spoke, his voice just as quiet, just as controlled. "You think I care?" He tilted his head slightly, watching as Gerald's expression shifted, as his confidence faltered just a fraction. "You think that's supposed to scare me?" He took a small step closer, not in aggression, but in certainty, making sure Gerald understood exactly what he was saying. "You don't have that kind of power over me. And if you think threatening my career is going to make me stay quiet, then you don't know me at all." Gerald's fingers twitched at his sides, his composure cracking for just a second before he forced himself back into control. He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head as if Leonardo was nothing more than an irritation. "You really think you're going to win this?" he muttered, taking a step back, regaining his distance. "You think you can turn this crew against me? You think they're on your side?" He let his eyes flicker around the set, gesturing toward the people who were still working, still avoiding the confrontation happening in front of them. "They don't care, DiCaprio. They want to keep their jobs. They'll forget all about this by tomorrow. Leonardo didn't look away. Maybe, but you won't. Gerald exhaled sharply, a bitter smirk forming on his lips. But there was something else there now, uncertainty. He had expected anger, maybe even an apology, a retreat, something he could use to re-establish his control. But this wasn't going the way he had planned. Leonardo wasn't backing down, wasn't afraid, and worst of all, he was making it clear that Gerald wasn't as untouchable as he believed himself to be. The tension between them stretched until one of the producers approached, sensing the confrontation, his expression tense. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glancing between the two men. He was careful with his words, careful with his tone. He knew better than to step too hard on either side. Not yet. Gerald didn't hesitate. He straightened, smoothing out his expression, his voice shifting into something more controlled, more professional. "No problem at all," he said, a hint of smugness returning. "Just a little misunderstanding." He shot one last glance at Leonardo before turning away, walking off without another word. Leonardo watched him go, knowing this wasn't over. Gerald wasn't the kind of man who let things go. But that didn't matter. The moment had already shifted, the weight of what had happened pressing down on everyone who had witnessed it. The cracks in Gerald's authority were already forming. The producer turned to Leonardo, hesitating before speaking. "You know, you didn't have to do that," he said carefully. "Not everyone would." Leonardo finally turned away from where Gerald had disappeared, his expression unreadable. "That's the problem," he said simply before stepping past the producer and back toward the set. The crew continued their work, but the energy had changed. People moved differently, glanced at each other with something new in their eyes. Some looked cautious, unsure, but some, just a few, looked like they were thinking, like they were considering something they hadn't before. And somewhere in the back, standing by her cart, Clara watched, her hands still resting on the handle. She didn't say anything, didn't move, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something shift, something she wasn't sure she had allowed herself to feel in years. Maybe things really could change. And for the first time, she wanted to believe it. The set didn't return to normal. Not really. People moved as if they were still walking on the edge of something uncertain, still unsure of what had shifted, but unable to ignore that something had. Gerald hadn't returned since their confrontation, and while no one said it out loud, his absence felt like a missing weight, a pressure that had been lifted without anyone daring to acknowledge it. The work continued, but there was hesitation, as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see whether what had unfolded would simply fade or if it would escalate into something bigger. Leonardo wasn't waiting. He had made his choice long before he stood up to Gerald, long before he had spoken Clara's name in front of people who had spent years pretending she didn't exist. He wasn't interested in temporary moments, in brief shows of defiance that meant nothing in the long run. He wanted change, real change, the kind that people couldn't ignore, the kind that didn't disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. He had seen what silence did, how it allowed men like Gerald to keep their power, how it let injustice become routine. He wasn't going to be a part of that silence. The producer who had stepped in earlier approached him again, his expression unreadable but careful. He wasn't a bad man, Leonardo could tell, just someone who had spent too much time in an industry where people learned to look the other way. He had the stance of someone trying to gauge how much trouble was worth getting involved in, how far a situation should go before it became something bigger than it needed to be. "Gerald won't let this go," the producer said, voice low, measured. "You know that, right?" Leonardo didn't flinch. "I know." The producer exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I get it, all right. No one likes him. No one likes the way he treats people, but he's still the director. He's got influence, and whether you care about your career or not, the rest of us don't have the luxury of walking away from something like this without consequences." He hesitated before adding, "Especially her." Leonardo's jaw tightened slightly. He knew what the producer was saying, knew that the people most affected by this weren't the ones like him. Actors with enough power and reputation to speak up without losing everything. It was Clara, it was the crew, it was the people who lived in the background, who weren't seen, who were easier to replace than they were to protect. He had spent enough time in this industry to understand how it worked, but that didn't mean he accepted it. "I'm not letting this go," Leonardo said, his voice steady, unwavering. "And neither should you." The producer studied him for a long moment, his expression shifting through something unspoken, something uncertain. Then he sighed, shaking his head slightly, as if he knew this was going to turn into something bigger than he wanted to deal with. But he didn't argue. It was a start. Later that evening, as the crew finished wrapping up for the day, Leonardo sought out Clara. She was where she always was, near the edge of the set, organizing her cart, ready to disappear into the background again. But this time, when he approached, she didn't avoid his gaze. She didn't shrink away, didn't pretend like none of it had happened. She watched him, waiting, guarded but present in a way she hadn't been before. "I know what you're thinking," Leonardo said, leaning against the nearby wall, arms crossed. "You think this is just another moment, just another thing people will talk about for a day and then forget about by tomorrow." Clara exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "I've been doing this a long time," she said, her voice steady, even. "I've seen men speak up before, say all the right things, get angry at the right moments. But nothing ever changes. Because at the end of the day, they walk away, and people like me stay." Leonardo nodded, not arguing, not dismissing her reality. "You're right," he said. "That's how it usually goes. But that's not how this is going to go." Clara studied him, her gaze sharp, skeptical but not dismissive. "And what makes you think this time is different?" "Because I'm not walking away," Leonardo said. "And I'm not letting anyone else walk away either." Clara held his gaze for a long time, as if testing him, searching for cracks, for the moment he would falter, the moment he would prove that this was just another temporary act of righteousness. But Leonardo didn't waver, didn't look away, didn't soften his stance. He meant what he said, and he needed her to see that. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Clara nodded. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. The next morning, when the crew arrived on set, they were met with something they hadn't expected. Gerald was gone. The production company had held a meeting overnight, and the decision had been made. He was removed from the project, effective immediately. No dramatic confrontation, no final words, just a quiet removal that spoke louder than anything else. People whispered, some stunned, some relieved, some waiting to see what the fallout would be. But no one spoke against it. No one defended him. Leonardo didn't celebrate. He didn't smile or act like this was some grand victory. This wasn't about winning, wasn't about proving a point. This was about making sure it never happened again. Later that day, Clara found him before she left. She didn't say much, just handed him a small folded piece of paper before walking away without waiting for a response. When Leonardo opened it, there were only 4 words written inside. "I see you now." And that was enough.